Hi everyone. So on this asynchronous day, we are going to finish our look at the English monarchy and how they had a harder time than the French establishing full absolutism. So as a very quick review of what we've already discussed, we discussed that the English monarchs have been limited throughout their history of having full power due to an event that happened in the year 1215, which is when King John was made to sign the Magna Carta by a group of nobles in order to limit his power. The Magna Carta essentially said that the monarch is subject to the law, not above it, and it begins to set the tradition of what becomes known as a constitutional monarchy. The group of nobles who makes him sign the Magna Carta create essentially a committee to check the power of the king that over time becomes parliament. Parliament is similar to our Congress. And so, the relationship between parliament and the monarch is different from monarch to monarch. Sometimes the parliament and the monarch get along really well. Sometimes they conflict. And so in the age of absolutism, during the time period that we're starting, what we'll see is that some monarchs are able to have a lot of power when they get along with the parliament, but there's an instance in which the parliament and the king do not get along, which leads to some political transformations. So this begins with the story of Charles I, who was of the Stuart family. So during the reign of Charles I, he has major conflict with the parliament. He is an Anglican monarch. Hopefully we remember that the Anglican Church was established after Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, and the Anglican Church makes it such that the monarch is the head of the church. It's supposed to be the state church of England. However, there were other religious groups within England. And so what we're seeing is that England and its religious diversity created problems for the monarchy, especially because during the age of Charles I, as well as some other monarchs, but especially under Charles I, he persecuted some religious minorities. And that created a lot of resentment. And there were other issues that led to a growing conflict. And the one particular group he persecuted the most were the Puritans. However, the Puritans were growing in population and growing in popularity, and many of them found their way into Parliament. Charles I, like I said, persecuted them pretty mercilessly, which caused a lot of Puritans to flee to North America as religious refugees. But otherwise, those that stayed, there was increasing tensions that eventually erupted into a civil war. And so, as I mentioned, the basic breakdown of the relationship between the monarchy and parliament is that parliament controls money. That's been their historic role. And Charles I is at war with so many different European groups, and so he's reliant on getting that money from parliament. So there's a particular incident where he has been using force to stop Parliament from meeting. And so what he would do is he would allow Parliament to meet so he could get his money, but then he would use his military to dissolve Parliament, which prevented them from meeting. And also for the general citizens of in and around London and some other towns in England, there was a constant military presence, and that was making Charles pretty unpopular. So popular support was behind Parliament. Parliament made Charles sign a treaty called the Petition of Right that had these clauses here, which really give us a sense for how much Charles was abusing power. Because in the Petition of Right, they're asking him to not imprison subjects without due cause, because he was just taking people as political prisoners, to not impose taxes without parliamentary consent, because he was imposing direct taxes at any rate he wanted to, without Parliament's approval, and the general populace found that to be, not okay. He was also housing soldiers in private houses, which the general populace hated, and in general, this was martial law. So Parliament asked him to agree to these terms. He initially agreed, but then immediately went back on his word and used his military to dissolve Parliament or to stop them from meeting, and this led to the outbreak of the English Civil War. So the two sides of the English Civil War, the first was the pro-Charles I side, And they were known as the Royalists. They're sometimes known as the Cavaliers. And then the other side were the Parliamentarians, who sometimes got the nickname the Roundheads. They were generally made up of Puritans and people who supported Parliament over Charles I. The nicknames I do want to highlight, specifically the nickname Roundheads for the Parliamentarians, was a way that the Royalists would make fun of the Parliamentarians, because what they were making fun of was the Puritan haircut. Because the style of the time by the upper classes and by Charles, if I go back, is this long hair. If we think back to Louis XIV, he also had that like long flowing hair. Like that was the, like I said, the nobility, the upper class style of the time. But if we remember, Puritan culture, which comes from Calvinism, doesn't want people to do anything but worship. They also want to prevent people from the sin of vanity. So they all had the same haircut. They didn't want anybody to stand out, and they got essentially this like little bob. So that's why they would call them the Roundheads. During the course of the English Civil War, the leader Oliver Cromwell rises to power. He becomes a military general, and he's apparently a very brutal general, very genius, and so this leads the parliamentarians to victory. So they end up winning. I want to show you this political cartoon from the time period because I think it's interesting and kind of funny. So what we see here, this is actually a political cartoon that showed up in these pamphlets because this is the 1600s. And if you remember anything about the lead up to the American Civil War, there was a lot of pamphleteering or pamphleting where people would write their beliefs down and print them out and share them. So this was happening in England before this happens in the 13 colonies because the concept of journalism as we know it today is rising. So this cartoon is titled The Dogs of War, and it is predicting that soon the two sides are going to fight. So on this side, these are the Cavaliers, or the Royalists, and we know them by their long hair. And on the other side are the Roundheads, or the Parliamentarians. And they're both like trying to sick their dogs of war on each other. So these are dogs. This is not a lion, but instead these are dogs, and the dogs have the corresponding haircuts of the people that they are supporting, which I think is kind of funny. So this dog, the Cavaliers are yelling, "To him, Poodle," and then the Roundheads are yelling at their dog, "Bite him, Pepper." I guess the dog's name is Pepper. And even the dogs are yelling at each other, "You round-headed cur, you Cavalier dog." It's very British, not super intimidating, but it's showing us early journalism. It's showing us the two sides. It's showing us some hair politics and stuff like that. And so Civil War erupts. Eventually the parliamentarians win. In the middle of the war, there's a very important event in which the parliamentarians captured Charles I, and they tried him for treason. They found him to be treasonous, and they executed him by decapitating him in front of a public audience. This is a huge event in European history and a really important event that sparked political debate amongst British thinkers in a movement known as the Enlightenment, which we will learn about. So this is an image, a painting of the event, where we can see, here's the crowd who came to witness the execution, since executions throughout most of history were public. And then up here are the parliamentarians who have committed the execution. So we can see they're all in black because remember, Puritanism is an offshoot of Calvinism, so they often wear very plain clothing. Here is the king. His head is over here. And so they charged him for treason because they believed by denying the petition of right, by going back on his word, and by simply not upholding the standards of the Magna Carta, that he was an illegitimate king. And thus, the people had the right to take power. So what we'll see is that in the British political world, people debate this. And some people say that the parliamentarians were in the wrong because the king had divine right to rule, they believed, and nothing can take that away. Whereas other people, such as famed thinker John Locke, believed that the parliamentarians were in the right because he agreed that Charles I did not uphold the law and was ruling thus illegitimately. Also, people like John Locke did not believe in divine right, and so he didn't think it was a fair defense for Charles I. So the English Civil War is very important globally because, as we'll see, the long-term effects of this are new laws, the concept of a constitution, and the idea of checks and balances on political leaders. And we'll also talk more about the political debates that surround this when we talk about the Enlightenment. So, just very briefly about the reign of the parliamentarians. So, after the English Civil War, the parliamentarians do rule for a period of time, and Oliver Cromwell reigns as a military dictator. Remember, Oliver Cromwell was the military general of the parliamentarians. He imposed Puritan culture on all of England and what really was the growing UK. So due to this, there was a cultural decline because remember, people who practice forms of Calvinism don't want things like theater or drinking or music that isn't, hymns or religious music and stuff like that. So they closed the theaters and they closed the pubs and they didn't allow sports and stuff like that. There was growing religious tensions, as there always has been, and this is military rule. So Oliver Cromwell was very unpopular. So initially people supported the parliamentarians, but once they saw how Oliver Cromwell was ruling, they didn't like him. This is also a devastating time for Ireland. The British had been invading Ireland shortly before this, but Oliver Cromwell completes this process and really persecutes the Irish citizens. The Irish citizens rebel a lot because they really dislike Cromwell. Cromwell in the Republic of Ireland might be one of the most hated people. So what he will do is he takes land from the Irish citizens and redistributes it to either pro-Cromwell Irish citizens who converted to Protestantism or to English citizens as they begin to move to Ireland. The result of this is a pretty steep population decrease in Ireland due to the war, the rebellions, but also due to famine. It's not the potato famine yet, that's later. But there's famine because there's so much war, he destroyed a bunch of crops, and also there's spread of disease. And just to give you a sense for how much changed under Oliver Cromwell, when Cromwell, shortly before Cromwell, we can see a Catholic land ownership. And by that, we're talking about, the Irish before the British come. So Catholic Irish land ownership was the majority in Ireland in 1641, but after the reign of Cromwell, we can see that most Irish lost their land. And so the Irish became landless peasants in their own land. And pro-Cromwell Irish Protestants and English citizens began to take over Ireland. So Ireland has effectively been colonized in this time period. A lot of growing tension. And so what happens is that people hate Cromwell so much that there's a coalition of forces that comes together to invite the monarchy back. So all these people had fought to get rid of the monarchy, but they disliked the military rule of Cromwell so much that they were like, you know what, let's bring back the monarchy. So they do. And so they look for who would have been next in line, and they invite back first this person named Charles II, and then after him ascends James II. And so that's kind of the next real big moment of this history. So James II was next in line, but he was Catholic. So here we're seeing just what a hot mess the religious situation is in England, especially since what your religion was often determined your politics. And so people really fear that if James II continues his reign, that there would be a Catholic dynasty and it would be, like handing over power to the Pope, right? So what happens is that the leadership, the Protestant leadership throughout England, especially the Anglicans, look to see who they could invite to challenge James II. And so they look at the lineage of the Stuart family, and they find that specifically there is a woman named Queen Mary who lives in the Netherlands and who had converted to Protestantism. And she was married to a great general named William of Orange. And so since she does have a claim to the throne, as she is James' daughter, James II's daughter, they talk to them about staging a coup to get rid of James and to install William and Mary as the leaders. So they coordinate, they invite William and Mary into London. And James II knows that William of Orange is such an incredible military leader that he has no shot at winning. And so James just flees. So it's a bloodless revolution. There's no war. They were ready for war. They thought they would have to fight. But when James is like, I'm out of here, he flees to France to be with other Catholics. And then William and Mary are installed as the King and Queen of England. That name might be familiar to you. The College William and Mary are named after them. They'll reign over what's called the Glorious Revolution. And so this revolution, this change in government is called the Glorious Revolution because it was bloodless overthrow, right? There was no actual war. And once they come to power, all of these political changes start to happen. So what happens is that a bunch of political leaders, with the help of William and Mary, write a constitution that includes the English Bill of Rights that puts into law key limitations of the monarchy and really outlines the power of the parliament versus the monarchy. So some of these political reforms include the English Bill of Rights. I'm going to show you some stuff that's in there. The concept of a constitutional monarchy. So from the 1700s, technically to the modern day, England is a constitutional monarchy, kind of. The monarch has done less and less over the years, but they still honor the monarch. So this means that the monarch is very limited by the Constitution, and it's detailed. They also passed what's called the Toleration Act, which is really interesting law. Essentially says that all religions should be tolerated and everyone should be able to practice their faith except Catholics. And specifically, they said Catholics can practice their religions, like they can go to church, but Catholics cannot hold most public office and Catholics cannot be monarch. So it's a Toleration Act except for Catholics. In this moment, they also establish the two-party political system. And in this moment, it's the Whigs and the Tories. So we can see there are some really big effects of this moment. So just to get a sense for what's in the English Bill of Rights, like I said, it limited the monarchy and elevated the status of Parliament. And the key liberties that they laid out should sound familiar because the United States founding documents, like the Articles of the Confederation and our own Bill of Rights, is pretty much a copy and paste from the English Bill of Rights, because obviously we're connected to English history. So it established the concept of elections. So freedom to elect members of Parliament without the King or Queen's interference. It established freedom of speech in Parliament so that the King or Queen couldn't arrest someone just because they didn't like a speech they gave in government. It established freedom from royal interference with the law, freedom to petition, freedom to bear arms for self-defense, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail, freedom from taxation by royal prerogative. So Parliament had to agree on levels of taxation. Freedoms of fines and forfeitures without trial. So this is huge, all right? So you had to have a trial before you had any punishment, which was not the case before. And freedom from armies being raised during peacetime. So again, all of this should sound really familiar to you. Excuse me. So lots of political transformations here. Also, if you'll remember, I explained that another way to show one's absolutism is through the establishment of colonies. And so, no surprise, monarchs had been building colonies the British monarchs had been building colonies. So in the year 1650, this is the state of the British Empire. It's going to explode later. But for now, their main colonies are the parts of the 13 colonies, some of the territories that they had in Canada. It's kind of hard to see because they're so small, but the British were very interested in establishing colonies in the Caribbean because remember, in the Caribbean they can grow a lot of those cash crops that bring in money, such as sugar. Also, they're starting to have a presence in parts of West Africa, a little presence in India and parts of Southeast Asia, and of course, we'll know Ireland has been fully colonized at this point. So the last bit for today is talking about an economic policy that goes along with absolutism, especially European absolutism. So the monarchs of the time period practiced an economic policy called mercantilism. You can also pronounce it mercantilism, either way. Mercantilism is the economic counterpart of absolutism. It is an economic practice the governments used to augment state power at the expense of other countries, at the expense of their colonies themselves. So the whole idea is that governments wanted to ensure that their exports exceeded their imports. They wanted to sell more than they bought. They wanted as much money as possible to flow into their countries and to specifically accumulate wealth in the form of what's called bullion, which means gold and silver. Because in this time period, many countries agreed that the best way to measure one's wealth was through gold and silver accumulation. So the whole idea, again, just to kind of explain this in a couple different ways, of mercantilism is to enrich the mother country. So they do this, like I said, by using things like tariffs and taxes and regulations to ensure that the mother country, such as England or France, gets super, super rich. You might have heard this before as the Make Mama Rich policy. So, got some images here. So the idea is that if we look over here, the mother country they want colonies because the colonies often have a lot of raw materials. So if we think about the Caribbean, a country like France would be able to, produce a lot of sugar, and then they would have brought in the sugar and produced, let's say, like liquor. It's like a rum, which really England made more of, and then they would sell that. But the other thing that they would do is that they would tax their colonies a lot to continue to bring in that money. I think, yeah, this is a good example too, right? So there's a lot of control of the colonies here, and we have to remember that the colonies have lots of different people living there. There are enslaved people, there are indigenous people, but there are also, let's say in the case of England, there are English citizens who moved to these colonies in order to work, and also religious refugees. So even though England had lots of colonies, so let's say the 13 colonies and let's say Barbados, those colonies were never allowed to directly trade with each other. People in those colonies could never make major economic decisions for their businesses. Everything had to go through the mother country, in this case, England. And over time, as you probably remember from the American Revolution, the mother country, in order to maximize their revenue, they begin to impose so many taxes. And the colonists get really angry at that, especially since they felt they had no representation. So mercantilism will make the mother countries rich in the short term, but create a lot of resentment in the long term. And I think that this cartoon really says it. It's super critical of the concept of mercantilism, because here's the mother country who's shown as, getting kind of plump off of the wealth of the colonies, and here are the colonies just handing over all of their resources, gold and silver, food, raw materials. So know this as the economic counterpart of absolutism, but also know this as something that is going to cause rebellion over time. All right, that's it for today.